Hello, and welcome to the Blue Shadow Podcast. My name is Joey, typically joined by a co-host Dan, but today I'm by my lonesome, and we're going to debut a new show today, and this is called Rewind and Rewatch. I feel like in the age of streaming and every company having a streaming service and every franchise having a new entry very often, it's often you end up in a situation where each individual project kind of comes and goes. Everything's so fast-paced. You kind of engage with it, you form an initial opinion, and then you kind of don't really think much about it again critically, other than, oh, this is what I thought of that thing when I watched it however long ago. So the goal of this show is to go back and revisit a movie or a series and look at various aspects of them and share, what we thought initially, and then after a rewatch, what do we think? Does it still hold up? Is there something we like that we needed to change our opinion on, or something that we didn't like that we kind of came around to? Or does it kind of stay the same? And to start with this, we're going to start with the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, which is about 2 years out from its release. So again, Obi-Wan Kenobi premiered with a two-part premiere on May 26th of 2022, and the finale ended on June 22nd, 2022. Again, that's a little over 2 years ago by the time this is being recorded and released. So there's been some time to kind of, sit, really think about it. And for me, I wanted to share, though, my initial thoughts going into Obi-Wan before I shared my, actual, what I thought of the show. I was elated. I always loved Obi-Wan Kenobi. Ewan McGregor was my favorite part of the prequels when I was growing up. And if you asked me what story I would want Disney to make when I knew that Disney had purchased Star Wars, something like this would have been my first choice. Something where Ewan McGregor was coming back. Maybe you involved Darth Vader. And this even took it steps beyond what I expected, and we'll talk about that. But now that I kind of told you I was really excited about the show, I was really looking forward to it. I remember when Kathleen Kennedy and Ewan McGregor were on stage and they announced that this was even happening. But for me, there was a lot going on in my life around the time Obi-Wan Kenobi was released. I was at a very chaotic portion of the biology graduate program that I'm in currently. This was the spring before my wedding, which happened in the fall. So there was lots of planning madness. And we also traveled during the week that episode 3 was released, which we had to watch it on my iPad, which is, not always the best way to consume something for the first time. So there was a lot going on while this was releasing. And I don't want to say it affected my enjoyment, but it kind of did affect my ability to really fully remember exactly what happened and develop these deep thoughts with it. So I haven't watched this show since that happened. And despite really wanting to, I always kind of think, oh, I'd like to watch Obi-Wan again. But, things kind of come and, new things are released constantly. So, you kind of have to make time to do stuff like that these days. And, I really wanted to take some time and re-engage with Obi-Wan. And my, initial thoughts when I first watched the show back in 2022 is I really enjoyed it. And based on the circumstances that I described to you, I didn't really engage with it as much as I would have liked, but you do know that I liked it. I did really like it because it did get some of the merchandise. I don't tend to get things from, shows or movies I'm not crazy about. So, I got the Black Series Obi-Wan lightsaber, the Black Series figure, Obi-Wan versus Darth Vader Lego set. That I really did enjoy it, and I liked what it had to offer. But over the last 2 years, I've kind of thought about the show, but as time has gone on, I've not really remembered necessarily all of the finer details. So I do want to touch on how I rewatched it. Over a few days, I watched it. Admittedly, one of them was on a plane, on an iPad during travel, which I did say wasn't the best way to consume something. But since, it wasn't the first time, I kind of washed it over. But overall, I was really relaxed and ready to, recommit to really forming a solid, revisit of the show. And so, as I mentioned, this Rewatch and Rewind is a new show, and the format is going to work by giving an aspect of the show. I'll share my initial thoughts on it from when I first watched it, which in this case is 2022, and then my current thoughts after rewatching it. So that's going to be the format. I'm going to give, one thing and then give my before and after opinion. So the first thing I want to start with there is the overall plot. I really liked it in 2022. Like I said earlier, it's not what I imagined it to be at all, but I really did enjoy it. And, I recall all the different, types of discourse, if you will, around Obi-Wan Kenobi and, there's some stuff that we'll talk about later that is complete nonsense, but some people were very worried about was Obi-Wan leaving Tatooine and if that was a good thing or a bad thing. But I honestly really didn't mind that at all. And I thought the decision to center the story around young Leia was bold and unexpected, and I really loved it. And there was nothing leading up to the marketing of the show that she would even be in it, which made it even more of a surprise. So that was my initial thoughts. And upon a rewatch, I would have to say this really held up for me. I still think the story focusing on the relationship between Obi-Wan and Leia, something we hadn't really explored before, was a fantastic choice. And the big story, the big picture aspects of the story were wonderful. And there were things I really, really liked. But there were some things that, on the first watch I liked a little more than when I went to revisit it. And there's some things that, kind of stayed the same. So let's get into those. To start, one of my favorite aspects of this show was, in fact, young Leia. It really was so fun to watch when we were first experiencing this. Vivian Lyra Blair was incredible. She really was young Leia, for lack of a better term. Every aspect of the character she played perfectly. It's almost as if you shrunk Carrie Fisher down to a 10-year-old and made her act. It was really nice. And I love that there was this connection that was forming between Leia and Obi-Wan. I already mentioned that, but I want to focus on it for just a second. Obi-Wan has a clear sense of favoritism in this show for Luke. And from watching A New Hope and the whole original trilogy, it's clear that he wanted Luke to be trained to be a Jedi. But here, it adds this nuance to it. And it kind of fills in some context to things, like why Leia would have been excited that Obi-Wan was coming when she was on the Death Star. Her excitement was more than just like, oh, this person I asked for help for was coming. And this kind of adds that to it. And it also could explain why she might name her son Ben, which we learn in the sequel trilogy. So I was all excited about all of this stuff on my first watch. And now going into the rewatch, I didn't think it was really possible, but I loved it even more. She just radiates exactly what you'd want Leia to be as a young girl. And I would love to see her in something again. I'm not sure what. I mean, an adaptation of the Princess of Alderaan book, I don't know. She would just be wonderful to appear in the future. And I did also want to say that upon a second rewatch, I grew even more appreciation for Bail and Breha and their being wonderful parents and, really looking out for her as their adoptive daughter. So with that kind of brings us moving on from Leia, which I, again, loved more than I even did the first time. It brings us to Obi-Wan's story. Upon first initial watch in 2022, loved it as well. I love the idea of him shutting himself off from everything, including the Force, living in a cave, just kind of like being a hollowed out version of his former self. And then establishing a connection with Leia and accepting what had happened to Anakin being what moves him past that was really, really nice to see. I really liked seeing him go from not having any bit of his old instincts as a Jedi to moving on to invading Fortress Inquisitorius, which was an awesome inclusion, and, getting more and more into himself, and then all the way to leading the evacuation of Jabim and acting like it was an episode of the Clone Wars or something we'd see from Revenge of the Sith, and really seeing him come into himself. I really enjoyed that. And upon, watching it just now, I thought, much like my thoughts on young Leia, my love for this aspect of the show grew even more. It was just so powerful to see this character who we knew as this strong-willed, relatively optimistic character move past his trauma and be the person that we, kind of bridge the connection between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. And I thought that this show did a fantastic job at taking Revenge of the Sith Obi-Wan and giving us Ben Kenobi from episode 4. And just, again, seeing him move past the trauma and, the inclusion of Anakin in this story really cemented it as something that was really special for me. And so moving into Anakin, when I first watched the show, I know some people had issues with him and Obi-Wan interacting. That didn't really bug me at all. I was just excited to see it. Their lightsaber fights, their physical altercations, I thought they were just okay. Nothing really stood out to me. And when I think about the flashback scene, I was initially a little disappointed. When this show was first airing, there were rumors circling about, the Clone Wars flashback. Is this the episode with the Clone Wars flashback? And I think I let that outside force shape my thoughts on the series, unfortunately, where if I wasn't getting essentially something like what we saw in Ahsoka in this dramatic Clone Wars flashback, I wasn't going to be happy. It just wasn't quite what I expected, and I didn't love it at first watch. But what I did love was seeing Hayden Christensen back, especially in the scene where Obi-Wan breaks his mask, and you can really see Hayden Christensen, Anakin, acting against Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan, and it just brings you back to Revenge of the Sith in a great way. I will say, as a very big Star Wars Rebels fan, it confused me a little to have the exact same story beat happen where, Ahsoka breaks one half of Anakin's mask and Obi-Wan does the exact same thing. But, I kind of got used to it, and, I accepted that, even though I thought it was a little redundant, but I know not everyone watches the animation and all of that. But this time around, I thought Anakin's inclusion, much like Obi-Wan and Leia, was even better. I thought the reveal that Anakin was still alive to Obi-Wan was chilling. Like, I don't know, maybe it kind of washed over me. Like I said, it was kind of chaotic when it was coming on, but just seeing just how affected he was by thinking that Anakin was dead and then realizing he was alive was really, really crazy. And, I just talked about how initially I didn't love the flashback where Obi-Wan and Anakin were fighting on Coruscant and training. But upon rewatching it, I think it was amazing. I just feel like I let the outside factors, get to me with wanting something more, but I should, it's best to engage with what you're actually seeing and not projecting what you want onto something. And for me, this second time, I love the nuance, showing that essentially in any interaction that they have, Obi-Wan knows exactly how to get the best of Anakin. And this was just showing that, like an earlier time when they were still friends, even Master and Padawan even, where it shows that Obi-Wan just knows him so well and is able to, outsmart him essentially. For me, the lightsaber duels grew on me a little bit more, especially the last one. I feel like that they billed it as the rematch of the century, which it's a high order, but it was very good, especially like when Obi-Wan is able to like lift all the rocks with the Force. It was really cool. And I grew to like the ending of that fight even more. I was just kind of okay with it, where Obi-Wan, he just leaves Anakin. And I think, after thinking about it a little bit more, was it a mistake? Could it have saved a whole lot of people at the end of the day? Maybe. I mean, hard to say. But for me, the fact that Obi-Wan was struggling because he had, in his mind, killed Anakin, the fact that he can let that be and, not be the one that does that, allowed him to go be the person we see at the end of it. And one other thing I wanted to say about Anakin is I thought it was very Darth Vader-y of him to just not really care about Reva. He, didn't care about her when she was a child, didn't care about her when she, was trying to attack him. So I thought it was very, Anakin of him. And speaking of Reva, when I first watched the show, I really loved her as a character. I thought Moses Ingram did a phenomenal job playing a very, very captivating character. And I did want to take a second to talk about the ridiculous hate that she got. It makes no sense. It was unfair. And I don't think any criticism of that substance, where it has nothing to do with the actual story or the character, is ridiculous. But as for the story, I love seeing the perspective of someone who directly survived Order 66, let alone an interaction with Vader. And despite this, though, again, liking the character, I love the Inquisitors. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I just thought some of the decisions they made with Reva were a little weird. And I will say that those issues that I had initially persist into the rewatch. So I'm just going to go into that now. So again, I do want to say, after rewatching it, I still love the character of Reva. I loved Moses Ingram's performance even more this time around, especially, the unique dynamic that she has with each character. Like this kind of tentative alliance sort of thing that her and Obi-Wan are kind of working on, the enemy relationship with all the other Inquisitors. I thought her motivations were very cool, but some of the decisions that the story has her make, I didn't quite love. And one of the things that I think is a little bit contentious amongst recently released Star Wars is people surviving lightsaber stabs. For me, it doesn't really bother me. Like, for example, when Sabine got stabbed in Ahsoka, it didn't bug me. She got medical attention right away. They had found her immediately. But here, I think it's intriguing that Reva survives 2 lightsaber stabbings, no medical attention. Definitely the second time, not quite sure about the first time. The Grand Inquisitor getting stabbed. It just seemed like there were some decisions that were made that didn't necessarily have to be like that in order to reach the same story points. And the biggest thing that I struggle with Reva is her going to find Luke, like where she finds the message that Bail left for Obi-Wan. The communicator Obi-Wan gives to Haja, he drops it. And, it just seems like a little bit of a stretch for me to have Reva go and, figure out that Luke is Anakin's kid and then go kill him. He doesn't even know about the kid. It just seemed a little convoluted. But I love that she got the opportunity to not become the thing that she hated most. But it just seemed like an odd way to kind of wrap up her story in the show, as it really wasn't directly connected to anything else in the show. But it did give us a chance to see some awesome Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru fight scenes that I never would have even knew I wanted. So that was very cool. And I want to wrap up discussion on Reva saying overall I did like her a lot. And honestly, I'm more excited about the potential of what could happen with her next than what happened with her in this show. I think she could potentially be involved in, the path and all of that. But I just struggled with some of the decisions that the character made as it could. I struggled to think through some of the decisions that she made, I guess is all I can really say. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the Inquisitors. As a massive Star Wars Rebels fan, like I said, I was very excited to see them here when I first watched this in 2022. And I love the fact that they bickered like children, which is relatively new for this show. But I thought it was really funny to have them like compete with one another. They're like these knockoff Sith, so they're going to behave like even worse Sith, honestly. I was a little confused, like I said, though, about the decision to, air quotes, kill the Grand Inquisitor. I get the idea, like, of having Reva eliminate someone to elevate herself, but I wondered if it might have been more impactful, and again, this is on first watch, more impactful if she killed someone else that could stay dead or something. And the decision of the Inquisitors and having them here, I felt very similar upon a rewatch. I still enjoyed the fact that they were there. I love that they were, the Grand Inquisitors. Seeing an animated character in live action is always really exciting. But it's hard for me to change my mind on some of the things that I had just said about. I think it could have been interesting to see them used a little more as well. They're never really an antagonist to the heroes of the show. They're kind of an antagonist to the antagonist almost. So like they're there to stir up Reva, but it could have been cool to see, maybe some more direct conflict, like a lightsaber fight between Inquisitors, or, have them actually interact with Obi-Wan a little bit more. I know that there's kind of like a lot of gymnastics you'd have to do to have a character interact with Obi-Wan and, him get away and all of that. But I think they could have been used a little more, and I'm not a writer. I would like to have seen more of them, though. I don't know how they could have been improved, but I would have liked to seen more of them. And again, like I said, it would have been nice if Reva could have, eliminated an Inquisitor to promote herself, and that, have lasting effects. Like, it's kind of just weird when the Grand Inquisitor comes back as if nothing had ever happened. I don't quite love that, but again, still very elated just to have the Inquisitors in more and more Star Wars. A few other things I want to talk about, starting with the idea of the path. This, when it first was released, I thought this was a really interesting idea, and I love the idea of the Jedi helping people throughout all their history, and now it's time for the people to turn around and help the Jedi. And I don't have a section dedicated to them, but I also love that introduced us to the characters of Tala and Ned B. And unfortunately, I really do wish we had more time with Tala. I think the concept of someone who enlists in the Empire because they genuinely believe in it and then have them defect is really, really interesting. And upon a rewatch, I love the path even more, especially because we've got some connections to that story since the initial release of Obi-Wan. So most prominently in Jedi Survivor, we actually got to participate in being part of the path, kind of, or at least see a path base that was led by Seer. And, maybe we did see a little bit of path connection in the Bad Batch through Asajj Ventress. And I will say this is one of the richest things for me that's introduced in this series, and I hope to see more of it in the future. I really enjoyed seeing the characters like Roken and Haja, I liked Haja, but I don't know if maybe he'll have a full turnaround and be a full productive member of the Path, but I would love to see more from the Path, and I do in fact think we will. I want to talk about Uncle Owen, Aunt Beru, and Luke. I kind of mentioned them a little bit, and when I first watched the show, I was a little frustrated with how difficult Uncle Owen was being, but I love that Aunt Beru was kind of giving him a hard time for it the whole time, and I thought it was really cool to see Luke as a child, and how different, like we know this from A New Hope, but it was interesting to see how different his and Leia's lives are, you know, on Tatooine versus Alderaan. Upon rewatching, I thought it was easier to empathize with Uncle Owen. Again, maybe it was just my, you know, wanting something different than what they gave us, but I really understood that Uncle Owen just wanted to protect Luke, and he viewed Obi-Wan as dangerous and just wanted him to kind of be kept away. And I ended up with loving this dynamic of the Larses and, you know, appreciating at the end Uncle Owen letting Obi-Wan meet Luke. I thought that was such a nice scene. And there are two more things I want to talk about. The first being the ending and the inclusion of Qui-Gon. And my opinions on this were the same both on my initial watch and my rewatch. I'm just going to talk about them as if it's one. I loved the inclusion of Qui-Gon. I love that Obi-Wan needed to get in touch with the Force to, you know, interact with him as a Force ghost. And I know this show doesn't need a second season, but I would really, really love to see it for me. I think it could be totally different. It can focus on just these two characters potentially, physically, and maybe delve into the Force or, you know, have visions of different other characters. I think it could be really unique and essentially give an entirely different perspective on Obi-Wan as a character and build up the relationship between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, which is something that was a wonderful part of The Phantom Menace, but something that unfortunately we had to stop there. And the last major thing I want to talk about is the show itself and the visual effects. I know a lot of people had a major problem with the effects upon their first release. I didn't really think much of it. This, like I mentioned, released at a rather chaotic time for me. I was just kind of going through, I liked the story, and these issues didn't really bug me. When the rewatch happened, I had more time to definitely see some of the complaints. For me, it's like, it feels like a bloated movie comment. This is something that, as we've got more and more Disney Plus shows, it for both Marvel and Star Wars, it can kind of feel like that. Like, sometimes episodes aren't standalone stories. They're just like you press pause on the movie, and then next week you come back and you press resume, which it's not a major problem for me, but it is definitely noticeable. It doesn't really affect my enjoyment of the show because I did watch a lot of the episodes back to back, but it definitely felt like this could have been a tighter movie than a Disney Plus show. And for me, I did want to talk about the CGI and the volume. The show isn't necessarily the best effort they've put forward of visual effects, and it sometimes shows that it's being recorded on the volume. I felt like the whole base on Jabim, particularly when Reva arrives with the stormtroopers, it does really look like it's in the volume, but it was early on in using the volume, and you know, it did happen during the pandemic, the filming, and I do think that they've improved in using that, but it is definitely noticeable. Overall, for me, these things don't detract from the story, which I've already told you I loved, and I loved even more the second time. But it can make the experience feel a little weighed down if you're bothered by that sort of thing. So that was kind of the end of all the aspects I want to talk about. And I want to end by talking about my favorite scene from the show. And it kind of encapsulates everything I love about the show. And then I want to give my final thoughts on the rewatch and see if Obi-Wan Kenobi held up after 2 years. So my favorite scene is in the finale episode where Obi-Wan goes to visit the Organas on Alderaan. And I'm specifically referring to the scene where he, you know, gets back to reunite with Leia, gives her Lola, and he starts talking about Anakin and Padme to her. And again, he's not giving her the names, he's not giving her crazy details, but it just pays tribute to his friends. Like, he's probably not gotten to think positively about Anakin and Padme in the 10 years between Return of the Jedi and the show. And it was just very nice to see him get that moment where he can honor his friends and draw a direct connection for us as Star Wars fans between the prequels and the original trilogy. And I did want to say that this also kind of pays tribute to an earlier scene where Leia's kind of bossing Obi-Wan around, and he's like very clearly thinking of Padme and says that she reminds him of an old friend. And I just thought that this was like the beating heart of the show and the emotions that it's trying to get you, that relationship between Obi-Wan and Leia, and it just, to me, kind of sums up some of the strongest parts of this show. And for me, wrapping up, overall, I found that after rewatching, I thoroughly enjoyed this series. It's probably the movie, show, or game, anything that's been released recently that's most connected to the events of the original 6 movies. And while I always love expanding the story in new ways, such as like The Acolyte, which is way removed from anything like this, I think it's comfortable that we also have a show like this existing. It's definitely not my favorite Disney Plus show personally. I love the some of the stuff they're doing in Ahsoka. Like, I have been really been enjoying The Acolyte. But for me, getting more Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan, having young Leia, further exploring Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship, and introducing really captivating concepts like the hidden path, I really think that the Obi-Wan Kenobi series will hold up against the test of time. I loved it, and I would be happy to watch it again. With that, I extend the offer to you to rewatch the show and let us know what you think. Do you think that this show held up? Have your opinions changed on it at all? But we'd love to hear from you, so please feel free to let us know what you think. We hope you enjoyed this new show that we're putting on, Rewind and Rewatch. We will continue to release more episodes of this, especially, like I said, as things, continue to be released, some stuff gets kind of lost back in the memory. So hopefully this can either motivate you to rewatch Obi-Wan, or you've already rewatched it and you can kind of think about it and kind of do this for yourself to remind yourself of things in the show. With that, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to give us a subscription or leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice, or give us a look on or subscribe on our YouTube page, Blue Shadow. And follow us on Twitter, X, at Blue Shadow Pod, or on Instagram at Blue Shadow Podcast, and consider following our Facebook page. With that, thank you so much. I appreciate you for listening, and we'll see you next time.